All right, so for this next PowerPoint, I wanted to kind of talk about what we've seen already. So we've gone through Renaissance. We talked about Da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. We just talked about the Baroque era, so things are a little darker and creepier. We're going to talk about Neoclassicism today. Next time we'll talk about Romanticism. And as you can see, things are going to start changing a lot in the art world with realism. Then we get into Impressionism, so Van Gogh, Monet, people that you know. Early 20th century, so things are getting a little weirder. Mid 20th century, all the way to contemporary art. So Neoclassicism, again, make sure you have a piece of paper so you can write this stuff down. If you don't have it, just pause, grab that, grab a pencil and paper. So Neoclassicism, this is from 1700 to 1825. So during this time period, this is the 18th century revival of Roman and Greek art and literature. They also started excavating Pompeii and Herculaneum. This is the time for enlightenment, so the age of reason. This also promoted individualism and free thinking through the use of reason, and they stressed order, balance, and clarity. So this is from the excavation of Pompeii. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It's a really interesting story. It's this city that pretty much just got surprised by this giant volcano, and everything got destroyed by this volcano, and a lot of the stuff was preserved. So a lot of the bodies were just stuck in this little cover of ashes. Also during this time period, they were discovering all of these old statues and these old marble buildings and things like that, and noticing how the heads were broken off in most of them. During that time period, right before this, there was this big war, and the enemies were going around and destroying all of the artworks, specifically the faces, as just an insult, as, you know, here's your artwork, kind of. We're going to destroy it so that you don't have anything to look at anymore. But we're going to leave this little part of it so it's a reminder as what we can do when we want to. So really interesting artworks. Then images of the ruins painted by the artists. So other than just excavating these sites, people were really starting to paint these excavation sites, because these were, you know, things that were really exciting, things that were being discovered that people had never seen before. So they couldn't take a picture, of course. So this was the way of kind of preserving this history and showing what was happening at that time period. How were they excavating everything? So you got some really incredible paintings. We're still in that kind of artwork where the lighting's very harsh, but we're also less painterly than the last one, where it was kind of, you know, you could see the paintbrush strokes and things like that. Now you're starting to see a little more detail than last time. And then this is how paintings used to be shown in art museums. So this is called gallery style. So all the paintings were just stacked up one on top of another. So the first famous person that we're really going to talk about is Jacques-Louis David. So he was a superstar in the art world during this time period. And as it says, the shapes are painted with refined, crisp technique. So he's not painterly like Caravaggio that we talked about. The light is often theatrical and dramatic, which is a lingering Baroque characteristic that we talked about during the last PowerPoint. And his major artworks are the Oath of Herati, the Death of Marat, and Napoleon Crossing the Alps, which we'll talk about. So this is a self-portrait of his. So it's a little painterly. You can kind of see, you know, brush strokes and things, but it's very detailed, especially the eyes and the details in the hair. So the first one that we're really going to talk about is the Oath of Herati. Now with this painting, there's a lot of details going on. You can see how he really wanted the viewer's eyes to kind of travel around this area. So everything points to these swords. It's kind of like the Last Supper that we talked about. All these lines are converging to this point that, you know, the artist wants you to see. Also, you've got these soldiers pointing their hands to these swords. So everything's leading your eyes to that area. He's also broken these sections up into these little triangle bits where the viewer can pinpoint their eyes. So at some point when you're looking at this painting, you're looking at the women on the right, and then you're looking at the arms and the swords and what everything is pointing at. But then you're also having your eyes directed towards the men on the left. And then you can even break it down to a little more detail. Once you move from those people, what else are you looking at? You're looking at their hands and the sword. You're also looking at these people in the back next to the women. And so, just to kind of sum this up, it depicts a scene from a Roman legend about a dispute between two warring cities, so Rome and Alba Longa, when three brothers from a Roman family, the Horates, agreed to end the war by fighting three brothers from a family of Alba Longa, the Curates. The three brothers, all of whom appear willing to sacrifice their lives for the good of Rome, are shown saluting their father who holds their swords out for them. And this is based on old books and old stories. However, the moment depicted in David's painting is his own invention, so this is something that he thought of on his own. Here's some of his sketches before he started painting it on the right. Here's one on the left. So you can see he put a lot of detail and a lot of time into figuring out exactly what he wanted to do before he started laying down any kind of paint. He's very, very particular about what he wanted to show. All right, the next one, The Death of Marat. This story is very, very interesting. This is another one that I would recommend Googling because it would take me a while to explain everything. But essentially what it was is this man, Marat, he had this skin condition where he would have to lay in the bathtub constantly and like soak his skin and make sure that he wasn't having all these skin issues. And he was a radical journalist, so he was someone that was all about free speech, and he would write all these crazy stories and kind of uncover all of these amazing things that were happening, but people really didn't like him. This painting shows when he was murdered in his bath. So if you can see there, he was often in the bath due to his known skin condition, which led to a female breaking into his house and stabbing him. And so he bled out into that tub. And what he shows during this painting is this whole idea of the bathtub, the writing, how he couldn't finish, the blood dripping from the stab wound. It's very, very intense. And then if you look at the very bottom, there's also the knife that he was stabbed with. So really intense scene. And again, it's another one that David is making you look all over the page for. It's not just, oh, there's that person. There's so many little details that he's putting around. His other famous painting is Napoleon Crossing the Alps. We'll talk more about this one later this semester because there's a really famous contemporary artist who's working today. His name's Kehinde Wiley, and he actually took this painting and did his own spin on it, which we'll talk about. Some other ones, The Oath of the Tennis Court. So you can see this painting is really, really big. It's 2 by 3 feet. And then this one's 20 feet by 32 feet. And if you've never seen a Nerdwriter video, he does these really, really deep dives into paintings and movies and TV shows and music and stuff. He's got a really interesting YouTube channel. I would recommend clicking on this video and watching this. He'll explain exactly what's happening with this painting and why it's so incredible. But I'll sum up some of it. So this depicts Socrates about to drink poison hemlock as a death sentence for corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing strange gods. So he was always questioning what was happening. Are the things that we're being told by politicians and our leaders, are they true? Maybe they're not. Maybe there isn't just one God. Maybe there's multiple gods and things like that. And so he was seen as very extreme. And of course, people didn't like that. And the government and the townspeople during that time thought that he was corrupting the youth. So they sentenced him to death, and he had to drink this poison hemlock. And as you can see, listed right here, Plato is seated in the front. the image is supposed to be projecting from the back of his head. So this is supposed to be his entire thought. And as you can see, Socrates is very nonchalant about this. He's standing up for what he believes in. He's like, okay, I'm going to die for what I believe in, but I don't care. And you can see how distraught everybody is, all of his followers and all the people that believe in his intelligence. Even the person that's handing him the poison is looking away. And you can notice in the background, there's also all of these people being ushered out. And then also notice, again, another throwback to the Sistine Chapel with this hand. Same for the Baroque era. So it becomes a common subject, a common thing to show, kind of a throwback to the previous art worlds. And then here's some of his drawings for this. And here's how we've moved so far. So we've gone from Renaissance to Baroque to Neoclassicism. So you can see that the artists are getting better. They're getting more intense. They're becoming more brave with what they're showing. And also during this time period, you have people like Thomas Jefferson, um, who are really, really big. This is our third president, scholar, economist, um, educational theorist, statesman. And he's also an architect. That's what, for our purpose, he was really known for. Um, but if you know stuff about Thomas Jefferson, you'll know that he owned slaves, and a lot of people are unhappy with how he's depicted in education now. Um, so just keep that in mind, that he's got a lot of baggage with him that's not great. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about his architecture and how he influenced, how buildings look then and how they look now. So you'll notice buildings like the ones that are on Transy's campus around us. They have a lot of these columns and these domes. And these were all things that Thomas Jefferson really, really made famous in designing buildings. He also designed the campus of the University of Virginia. He did the Virginia State Capitol. Monticello is his home that he designed in Virginia. So you can see it's a really, really nice area. It's also depicted on the $2 bill, or was depicted on the $2 bill. It's also on the back of the nickel. And his whole thing is he liked to design buildings with a lot of natural light. So, they couldn't just plug in a lamp and have light wherever they wanted. So it was very important that using the space that you had and looking at where the sun would be at certain times of the day, where could you put windows and get those aspects of lighting without having to, light a candle. And then here's some of what we were talking about with the last PowerPoint. So with neoclassical music, before this, we have Vivaldi and Bach, and now we're getting into what you really know as classical music. So Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. And during this time, the classical music characteristics, there's a contrast of mood. There's a lot of varieties in rhythm, and you'll hear a lot of texture in the music. Really singable melodies. So what I mean by that is something that you could hum in your head. Like dun 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 dun. That's something that you can do. It's not very hard, but it's very memorable. So Mozart, probably the most famous from this time period. I put YouTube videos on there. So if you're not familiar with Mozart, click on that, and you'll get an idea of what his music sounds like. I can guarantee you've heard some of his music before. He was known as a child prodigy that was known for his pure classical style. During his lifetime, he produced over 600 musical pieces. The next person, Joseph Haydn. Again, another playlist. I would click on this and kind of listen through that. He was an innovator who liked to experiment. He hated the general rules of composition. He helped to develop the symphony and the string quartet, and many of his pieces had nicknames. And just so a symphony is an orchestral composition that usually has 4 movements that typically last 20 to 45 minutes. And a string quartet is a composition for 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello, typically. The last famous person that I want to talk about really briefly is Beethoven. So he was a German musician and composer that fused the classical and romantic periods. Beethoven began to lose his hearing around the age of 30, but continued to compose. So he's your deaf composer that you probably remember. I put two of his most famous pieces on here, so click on those just so you can know who he is. You have definitely heard those two pieces. Haydn taught Beethoven composition, and he said Beethoven will one day be one of Europe's greatest composers, and I'm proud that I was his teacher. So he knew how talented Beethoven was even as a child. And then his style, he's got extremes of piano and forte. He writes a lot in the minor keys. He has wide leaping arpeggio scales and ascending and descending runs of notes. And tonally, he can sound off. And a lot of people attribute that to him being deaf, but a lot of scholars think that's just his style. That's what he wanted you to be thrown off by. He wanted you to listen to this music and be like, oh, that's different. That stands out to me. And then during this time period with the theater, a lot of satire is being used. So this is a technique used to criticize an event, an individual, a group, an idea, attitude, institutional, or social practice in a clever way. It's usually, very witty and funny, and it's making fun of everything that's happening. And there's a lot of sarcasm. And it was insulting to, higher up people, the rich people, the politicians, because that's typically who was being made fun of. Um, but yeah, that's simply that time period, neoclassicism. Please go through there, write down some of these notes, and listen to some of that music quickly, just so you can kind of get an idea of what's happening around